I don't remember writing the note.
That was the first thing that didn't make sense. It was sitting in the middle of my kitchen counter, like I'd left it there on purpose. I don't usually leave notes for myself. Not physical ones, anyway. If I need to remember something, I put it in my phone like everyone else. Calendar reminders, grocery lists, the occasional alarm I forget to turn off. Paper feels unnecessary. Easy to lose, easy to ignore. That morning started the same as most others. I woke up a little before my alarm, the way I usually do, like my body doesn't quite trust it to go off on time. The room was still dim, that flat gray light that seeps in through the curtains before the sun properly shows up. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if I felt rested or just less tired. The radiator clicked softly, pipes shifting somewhere in the building. Someone upstairs moving around, footsteps, then a chair scraping. Normal sounds, familiar. I reached for my phone. No notifications. 7:12 a.m. I got up, pulled on yesterday's clothes from the chair, and went into the kitchen. It's a small place, one of those one-bedroom flats where everything feels just slightly closer together than it should be. You can stand in the kitchen and reach the sink, the kettle, and the fridge without taking more than a step or two. I've lived here long enough that I don't really notice it anymore. I filled the kettle, switched it on, and leaned against the counter while it heated. My eyes drifted over the usual things, the drying rack by the sink, a mug I'd forgotten to put away, a couple of unopened letters near the edge of the counter. And then I saw it. A piece of paper right in the middle of the counter, folded once. I don't remember putting it there. At first, I thought maybe it was one of the letters, just moved around. But the paper looked different, plain, no envelope, no print, just a single sheet. I picked it up. It wasn't anything special, standard white paper, slightly creased from being folded. No smell, no marks on the outside. I unfolded it. There was a single line written in black ink. Don't forget to check the back of the wardrobe. I stood there for a second, reading it again. The handwriting was mine, or close enough that my brain didn't question it right away. Same general shape, same way I loop certain letters, same slight slant. But something about it didn't sit right. The spacing felt uneven, like whoever wrote it had been rushing, or distracted. I tried to think when I might have written it. Last night, maybe, before bed, but I didn't remember needing to check anything in the wardrobe. There was nothing in there except clothes, shoes, a couple of storage boxes on the top shelf. I turned the paper over. Nothing on the back. I looked around the kitchen like there might be something else that would explain it. Another note, a reason. Nothing. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People forget things. I forget things. It's not strange to write something down and then not remember doing it, especially if you're tired. I'd had a long week. Work had been busy. It made sense. Still, I stood there longer than I needed to. Then I folded the note again and set it back on the counter. Check the wardrobe, I said quietly, like saying it out loud might help it land. It didn't. The kettle clicked off. I made my coffee, carried it into the bedroom, and set it down on the dresser. The wardrobe was against the far wall, the sliding doors slightly misaligned the way they always were. I hesitated for a second. It felt unnecessary. I knew what was in there, but I'd already walked in here. It would take 10 seconds. I slid one of the doors open. Everything looked normal at first glance. Clothes hanging in a row, shirts, jackets, a couple of things I hadn't worn in months but hadn't gotten around to throwing out. Shoes lined up along the bottom, storage boxes above. I took a step closer. That's when I noticed it. Not something obvious, just small things. The shoes. They were lined up more neatly than usual. Not just tidy, intentional. Like someone had taken the time to fix something I hadn't noticed was wrong. I crouched slightly, looking at them. Maybe I'd tidied up without thinking. It happens. I straightened and reached for one of the jackets. It was turned inside out. Not fully, just one sleeve, twisted so the lining was visible. The rest of it looked fine, but that detail stood out. I frowned.
I tried to remember the last time I wore that jacket. A few days ago, maybe. It had been raining. I definitely wore it then, but I didn't remember turning it inside out. Why would I? I touched the fabric, like that would help me figure it out. It was dry, normal. I glanced at the rest of the clothes. Nothing else looked wrong, just that one sleeve. I slid the door further open, exposing the back of the wardrobe. There wasn't much to see, just the wall behind it, a bit of dust near the corners, the lower edge of the hanging rail. I leaned in slightly, peering behind the clothes. Nothing. No hidden compartment, no object tucked away, no second note. Just the back of the wardrobe. I stayed there for a moment, looking anyway, waiting maybe for something to stand out. It didn't. After a while, I stepped back and let the door slide closed. Nothing, I said out loud again. It sounded flat in the room. I picked up my coffee and took a sip. It had already cooled a little. For a second, I considered the possibility that someone else had been in the flat. That thought didn't last long. There were no signs of it. The door had been locked. Everything else was exactly where it should be, and the handwriting was mine. That part mattered. I went back into the kitchen. The note was still on the counter, exactly where I'd left it. I picked it up again, looked at it one more time. Don't forget to check the back of the wardrobe. I had checked it. There was nothing there. I folded the paper carefully this time and placed it off to the side, near the unopened letters. Then I finished my coffee, got ready for work, and left the flat. By the time I locked the door behind me, it already felt like something small. One of those odd moments you notice and then move past. Still, as I walked down the stairs, I found myself replaying it. Not the note itself, just the details. The shoes, the jacket sleeve. The way everything had looked normal, but slightly more arranged than I remembered. Like someone had been there. Or like I had, and just didn't remember doing it. I told myself it didn't matter, but the thought stayed with me longer than it should have. Not the note, just the feeling that something had already happened, and I was the only part of it missing. The thought stayed with me longer than it should have. Not in a dramatic way. It didn't feel urgent or sharp, just present, like a background noise I couldn't quite tune out. Work helped at first. Emails, meetings, the usual small decisions that fill up a day. By mid-morning, I'd almost convinced myself the note didn't matter, that it was exactly what it looked like. A forgettable moment stretched slightly out of proportion because I'd paid too much attention to it. That happens. You focus on something ordinary for too long, and it starts to feel strange. By lunch, I wasn't thinking about it at all. It came back when I reached into my pocket. I was standing in line at a cafe, one I go to a few times a week. Same place, same order. I pulled out my wallet to pay and felt something else in the pocket. Paper, folded. For a second, I assumed it was a receipt. I took it out without really looking. Same kind of paper, same size, folded once. I didn't open it right away. I just held it there, looking at it, already knowing what I was going to see. That wasn't a thought so much as a quiet certainty. I unfolded it. Check the book on the bedside table. The handwriting matched the first note. Mine. Or close enough that I couldn't find a clean way to separate it. I looked around, half expecting something in the environment to shift with it. Like there would be some small confirmation that this made sense. There wasn't. People talking. Coffee machine steaming. Someone behind me. Everything exactly as it should be. I folded the note again, slower this time, more deliberate. There are simple explanations for things like this. That was the first one I reached for. I could have written it earlier and forgotten, slipped it into my pocket without thinking, maybe even this morning after finding the first note. Some kind of automatic follow-up. That seemed reasonable, except I didn't remember doing that either. Still, memory isn't precise. It leaves gaps, fills them in later with something that feels right. I told myself that was what this was. A gap, nothing more. I paid, took my coffee, and went back to the office. The note stayed in my pocket for the rest of the afternoon. I didn't look at it again. There didn't seem to be any point. By the time I got home, the light outside had already started to fade. That same flat gray tone, just darker now, settling into the edges of things. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and paused. Not because anything looked different, because I expected it to. The feeling was immediate, quiet, but there. Like walking into a room where someone had just been, even if you couldn't see any signs of it. I closed the door behind me. The flat looked exactly the same as when I'd left. The note on the counter still off to the side, near the unopened letters. Nothing moved. Nothing missing. I set my bag down, took off my jacket, and stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I reached into my pocket and took out the second note. Check the book on the bedside table. It felt procedural now. Less like a surprise, more like something I was supposed to follow through on. That, more than anything, made me uncomfortable. I went into the bedroom. The bedside table was where it always was. Lamp, phone charger, a book I'd been reading but hadn't touched in a few days. I picked it up. There was nothing unusual about it at first. The bookmark still in place, about a third of the way through. The pages slightly bent at the corners. I flicked it open. A folded piece of paper slid out and landed on the floor. I stared at it for a second before picking it up. Same paper, same fold. My handwriting. Don't answer the phone at 2:17. I read it twice, then a third time. It didn't feel like the others. The first two had been instructions tied to places, things I could check, verify, dismiss if nothing was there. This was different. It wasn't telling me to look for something, it was telling me not to do something. And it was specific. 2:17. I glanced at my phone on the table. 6:42 p.m. There was no reason to assume it meant today. No reason to assume it meant anything at all. Still, I felt something shift slightly. Not panic, not even worry, just a subtle tightening. I set the note down on the table, next to the book. Okay, I said. It sounded like I was agreeing to something. I didn't like that. I went back into the kitchen, made something to eat, turned the TV on without really watching it. I kept expecting another note to appear. In a drawer, under a plate, somewhere obvious. Nothing did. At some point, I checked the time again. 7:31. Then later, 8:12. Each time, the number felt more relevant than it should have. I tried to map it logically. If I'd written these, there had to be a reason, some sequence. Check the wardrobe. Check the book. Don't answer the phone. It implied order, cause and effect. But the first two had led to nothing. No discovery, no explanation, just more notes. Which meant either the sequence hadn't finished, or I was missing something in what I'd already done. I went back to the bedroom, the wardrobe, the book. I checked both again, more carefully this time. Nothing new. No hidden compartments, no additional notes. Just the same quiet, slightly too ordered feeling. I stood there for a while, trying to decide what I expected to find. Eventually, I gave up and went back to the living room. The note about 217 was still on the bedside table. I could see it from where I was sitting. At some point, I must have dozed off. Not properly asleep, just that in-between state where time moves strangely. I woke up to the sound of something small shifting. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Then I realized. The phone. It hadn't rung. It had moved. A slight vibration against the table. I sat up. The room was darker now. The TV still on, muted. I checked the time. 2:16. I kept looking at it, not because I expected anything to happen, just to prove to myself that nothing would. For a second, nothing happened. Then the phone rang. The sound felt sharper than usual, too clear in the quiet of the room. I didn't move right away. The note. Don't answer the phone at 2:17. I could let it ring. That would be the simplest way to prove this didn't mean anything, that I hadn't written it for a reason. The phone kept ringing. I reached for it anyway. Hello? For a second, there was nothing. No static, no background noise, just a slight delay. Then, hello? My voice. Not an exact match. Slightly off. Flattened, like it had been recorded and played back through something that didn't quite capture the full range. There was a pause. Then, I don't... The sentence cut briefly, like something had interrupted it. Remember writing the note. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. The timing was wrong. The cadence. It was too close to what I'd said that morning. Not exactly the same, but close enough that I didn't need to think about it. On the other end, the voice went quiet. I waited. Nothing. Then, softer this time, check the back of the wardrobe. The line went dead. I stayed there, phone still against my ear, long after the call had ended. The room felt exactly the same. Nothing had changed, but the sequence had. Before, there had been a possibility that this was all explainable. Memory gaps, habit, something small, contained. Now there was something else. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a single, clear detail that didn't fit anywhere. Something that shouldn't have been possible, but had happened anyway. I lowered the phone slowly. On the bedside table, the note was still there. Don't answer the phone at 2:17. I looked at it for a long time. Then, without really deciding to, I turned and walked back to the bedroom. The wardrobe door was still slightly misaligned, exactly as I'd left it. I slid it open, and for a moment, I just stood there, looking at the shoes, the jackets, the same careful arrangement I'd noticed that morning. Everything exactly in place. Except now, I couldn't tell if it had always been like that, or if I was only just starting to see it properly. I left the wardrobe open for a while after that. Not because I expected anything else to happen. I think I just didn't want to close it and return the room to exactly what it had been before. The open door changed something small in the shape of the flat. It made the bedroom look interrupted, less settled. I stood there looking at the jackets, the shoes, the storage boxes above, trying to understand what the call had actually changed. The answer, as far as I could tell, was nothing visible. That was the problem. If something had been out of place, if a drawer had been open, if another note had appeared in plain sight, if I'd found a second phone hidden somewhere with a recording on it, at least that would have given the feeling somewhere to go. Instead, there was just the same room, the same clothes, the same faint smell of dust and detergent, and the fact that a voice on the phone had sounded like mine. I closed the wardrobe and went back into the living room. The digital clock on the microwave read 2:24. The TV was still on mute, flickering through late-night adverts with the brightness turned low. I turned it off, then stood in the dark for a moment, phone in one hand, the note still on the bedside table behind me. By morning, I had decided on the only explanation that felt even remotely usable. Pattern. Not meaning, not intent, just pattern. Something my brain could arrange into shape, without asking if it belonged there. People are good at finding it, even when it isn't there, especially when they're tired, especially when they've had too little sleep and too much time alone with their own thoughts. Give the brain a few disconnected details, and it will do the rest. It will smooth over the gaps, connect points that were never meant to meet, give shape to things that don't have one. That felt true, or true enough to function. I called in sick to work. Not for any dramatic reason, I just knew I wasn't going to get through a day of normal conversation while pretending the night before had fit inside normal life. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and laid out the notes in front of me. There were 3 now. Don't forget to check the back of the wardrobe. Check the book on the bedside table. Don't answer the phone at 2:17. Seen together, they looked more deliberate than they had separately. Not random reminders. Steps. I got a notebook from the drawer, the cheap spiral one I use for shopping lists and measurements when I buy furniture, and started writing everything down. Time found, location, exact wording, paper type, ink color. I wrote down the call too. Not just what the voice had said, but the delay before it spoke, the slight flattening of the sound, the places where it seemed to cut out. I tried to be precise, because precision felt safer than interpretation. Then I took one of the notes and compared the handwriting to my own. I copied the same sentence beneath it. Slowly at first, then again faster, then again without looking too hard at the original. It matched. That was the obvious part. The less obvious part was that it matched in the wrong way. The note looked like my handwriting the way a familiar face looks right from across the street, then shifts slightly when it gets close. The shapes were mine, but the pressure wasn't. Some letters looked too careful. Others looked as though they'd been written in a hurry I didn't recognize. My handwriting changes when I'm tired, but not like that. Not consistently. The lowercase y's dipped too low. The t's were crossed a fraction too late, too far to the right. There was nothing I could point to that made it not mine. Still, the longer I looked, the less it felt like it belonged to me in any ordinary way. Around 11, I found another note. I hadn't gone looking for it. I was rinsing out my coffee mug when I opened the cutlery drawer for a teaspoon and saw a folded square of white paper sitting under the edge of the tray. It was positioned so neatly I might have missed it if I'd reached for the spoon first. I just stood there with the drawer open. Then I picked it up and unfolded it. When the bus breaks outside, count to 4 before you look up. I read it once, then again. This one felt different too. More specific, but in a smaller way. Less like an instruction tied to a major event, more like something that was already moving toward me. I checked the time. 11:03. There's a bus stop outside the building, but not directly under my window. You hear them before you see them. Air brakes, doors, the low engine idling for a few seconds before it pulls away again. It's just part of the street noise here. Usually I tune it out. I left the note on the counter,
and told myself I wasn't going to follow it. Then I sat down in the living room and listened. 3 minutes later, I heard it. The soft, hydraulic hiss of brakes outside. Without thinking, I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I looked up. A man in a red coat was standing at the bus stop, one hand raised to his mouth, coughing into his fist. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impossible. There was nothing in the scene that justified the feeling that moved through me, except that the note had made me wait for it. Because I had, the moment didn't feel like something I was observing. It felt like something I had already agreed to. I got up and went to the window anyway, as if changing the angle might make the moment feel less exact. The bus was already pulling away. The man was still there, red coat bright against the damp gray pavement. It could have been coincidence. Of course it could. People stand at bus stops. People cough. Red coats exist. But that wasn't really the point. The point was that for 4 seconds, I had done exactly what the note told me to do. And because I had, the moment had arrived, already shaped. By noon, I had added a new section to the notebook. Predictions. Not all of them qualified. The first 2 notes had led me somewhere, but they hadn't predicted anything. The phone call had. Now this one had too, in a smaller, more ordinary way. I wrote both down. Then, beneath them, I wrote something else. Am I following them because they know what will happen? Or am I only noticing what happens because they tell me where to look? I left the question there. That afternoon, I found another note in the pages of the notebook itself. That was the first one that felt personal. Not because of where it was, though that mattered. Mostly because of what it said. Don't call your mother back until after 6:10. She'll mention the blue bowl. I stared at it for a long time. My mother had called the night before while I was asleep. I'd seen the missed call, but hadn't returned it yet. She lives 2 hours away and has a habit of leaving voicemails for things that don't need them. Recipes, weather complaints, reminders about relatives I barely know. There was no reason she would mention a blue bowl. Unless she meant the one from my grandmother's house. The chipped ceramic one that sat on the kitchen counter for years, holding keys and rubber bands and receipts. We hadn't talked about that bowl in months, maybe longer. I checked my phone. 1 missed call, 1 voicemail I still hadn't played. The time was 4:48. I put the note down and walked into the bedroom, then came back out again almost immediately, aware of how pointless the movement was. I didn't know what I was checking for anymore. The flat had started to feel less like a place I was in and more like a surface things were being arranged on. At 5:12, I almost called her anyway. At 5:19, I decided not to. By then, not following the note felt less like independence and more like improvisation. I didn't know which version of the day would have been mine if the notes hadn't been there first. So I waited. At 6:14, I called her back. We spoke for less than 5 minutes. She asked if I was working too hard. She asked if I'd eaten. Then, halfway through a sentence about clearing out an old cupboard, she said, almost absent-mindedly, "I found that blue bowl of your grandmother's, the one with the chip on the rim." I didn't say anything for a second, long enough that I could hear the space between her words, like something had already happened and I was catching up to it. "Are you there?" she said. "Yeah, I'm here." After I hung up, I wrote it down carefully. Exact time, exact wording as close as I could remember. Then I sat there at the kitchen table, notebook open, notes spread around me in a loose row, and understood something I hadn't wanted to put into words before. The notes weren't just finding me anymore. They were getting ahead of me. Not by much,
minutes, hours, small things. A phone call, a man at a bus stop, a sentence my mother hadn't said yet. Nothing impossible. Nothing I could take to someone else without hearing it flattened into stress, routine, coincidence. But it was enough. Enough to make the flat feel less stable. Enough to make my own choices feel slightly prearranged. I picked up the most recent note and looked at the handwriting again. Mine. Almost. Close enough that I could feel my mind trying to settle the difference and failing.
Then I turned to the next blank page in the notebook and wrote, as neatly as I could, things the notes know before I do. Then, after a second, I wrote another line beneath it and left space below. I didn't fill it in. The sentence felt incomplete in a way that was hard to fix without forcing it. I left the pen on the table and leaned back slightly, looking at the line as if the rest might suggest itself if I gave it time. It didn't. After a while, I closed the notebook and set it aside. The notes were still spread out across the table, each one occupying its own small space. I noticed, without meaning to, that I'd aligned them, edges parallel, equal distance between them. I hadn't done that on purpose, or I didn't remember doing it. I stood up and moved into the bedroom, not because I was looking for anything specific, just continuing the same quiet loop through the flat I'd been doing all morning. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, back again. The wardrobe was closed now, the bedside table unchanged. I turned slightly, letting my eyes pass over the dresser. There's a drawer at the bottom. I use it for things that don't need to be accessed often. Cables, old receipts, spare batteries. The kind of items that collect over time without ever being sorted properly. I don't open it much. That stood out to me. Not as a thought I'd had before, but as something that felt newly relevant. I stepped closer and pulled the drawer open. Everything inside looked as expected. Loose items, nothing organized, a tangle of wires, a folded instruction booklet, a pen without a cap, and a piece of paper, folded once, placed flat, slightly off to one side. I felt the pause before I touched it. Then I picked it up and unfolded it. Don't open this drawer again. Do not look at the photo. I read it once, then again, slower. The wording was different from the others, more direct, less like a reminder, more like a boundary. I looked down at the drawer. It was already open. That part of the instruction had already been ignored, which made the second part feel delayed, like it had been written for a moment just slightly earlier than this one. I kept holding the note, my other hand resting on the edge of the drawer. There's a simple version of what to do next. Close it, put the note back, continue the pattern. That would be consistent with everything else so far. Follow the instruction, reduce the uncertainty, stay inside whatever structure these notes were building. I slid the drawer halfway closed, then stopped. The hesitation wasn't about the photo itself. It was about the fact that the note assumed I would find it, that I would be here, in this position, at this point in time, and that something inside the drawer mattered enough to be explicitly avoided. I opened it again, slowly. I moved things aside one at a time, not searching exactly, more like confirming that there was nothing there. Cables, paper, the pen, nothing underneath. I ran my fingers along the back edge of the drawer, pressing lightly against the base. It shifted. Not much, just enough to notice. I pressed again, more deliberately this time, and felt the panel give slightly under the pressure. A false bottom. That didn't feel surprising. That was the part that stood out. I slid the panel aside. There was a photograph underneath. I picked it up.
The paper was matte, slightly thicker than normal printer paper. The edges were clean, but not perfectly cut, like it had been trimmed by hand. I held it at a distance for a second, then closer. It was me. Not a version of me, not something distorted or unclear. Just me. Standing somewhere I didn't recognize, outdoors. The background was soft, out of focus. Trees, maybe, or a line of hedges. The light looked like late afternoon, flat, slightly warm, but not bright. Nothing unusual about it. That was the first thing I noticed. It looked like any other photo someone might take without thinking too much about it. I was facing the camera. My expression was neutral, not smiling, not caught mid-motion. Just standing there. The second thing I noticed was that I wasn't alone. Someone was standing next to me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. Their face had been scratched out, not blurred, not covered, scratched. Thin, overlapping lines cut directly into the surface of the photo, removing the features beneath. The rest of the image was intact, but that section had been deliberately damaged. I tilted the photo slightly, letting the light catch the surface. There was no detail left under the scratches, just white where the paper had been worn away. I looked back at myself. The clothes felt familiar in a general way. Things I might own. A jacket I could imagine wearing. But I couldn't place them in time. There was nothing in the image that told me when it had been taken, or where. I tried to remember the moment, standing there, whoever had been next to me. Nothing. Not even a vague impression. No sense of recognition, beyond the fact that I could see myself in the frame. I turned the photo over. Blank. No writing, no date. I stood there for a while, holding it, waiting for something to connect. It didn't. The only thing that stayed consistent was the feeling that the image was real. Not staged, not symbolic, just a normal photograph of a moment I couldn't remember. And that absence felt deliberate. I slid the panel back into place and closed the drawer. The note was still in my other hand. Don't open this drawer again. Do not look at the photo. I folded it slowly. Then I walked back into the kitchen and placed it next to the others. For a few seconds, nothing changed. The flat stayed quiet. The arrangement on the table stayed exactly as I'd left it. Then I noticed another piece of paper. It wasn't there before, not among the others. It sat slightly apart, closer to the edge of the table. I picked it up. Same paper, same fold. I unfolded it. You weren't supposed to see that. I read it once, then again. The handwriting matched. Mine. But this time, the difference felt more immediate. Not in the shape of the letters, in the pressure. The ink looked heavier in some places, as if the pen had been pressed down harder than usual. The lines weren't uneven exactly, just slightly forced. I looked back toward the bedroom, at the closed drawer, at the place where the photo now sat, hidden again. The note didn't offer anything else. No instruction, no next step, just a response. You weren't supposed to see that. I held it there for a moment longer, then set it down carefully. The pattern had shifted again. Before, the notes had led. Then they had predicted. Now they were reacting. Which meant whatever was writing them wasn't just ahead of me. It was adjusting. I opened the notebook again and turned to the page with the unfinished line. Things the notes know before I do. I added another line beneath it. Things the notes are trying to keep from me. I paused. Then, after a second, I added one more. and the parts of my life that don't belong to me anymore.
I didn't go back to work the next day. Not because I felt unwell, because the idea of moving through a normal routine, surrounded by people who expected me to behave like myself, felt harder than staying here and trying to keep things contained. Still, by late morning, that started to feel like another kind of avoidance. The notes hadn't told me to stay in. That stood out. Everything else had been specific, timed, directed. The absence of instruction felt deliberate. I got dressed anyway. Same clothes I had worn earlier in the week, shoes by the door, lined up, still slightly too neat. I hesitated for a second, then I put them on. On the kitchen table, the notes were exactly where I had left them. For a moment, I expected another one to appear, something like, "Leave now," or "Don't go in today." Nothing did. I picked up my keys and left the flat. The walk felt different. Not wrong, just less automatic. I noticed things I wouldn't normally pay attention to. The timing of the traffic lights, the spacing between people, the way I adjusted my pace without thinking. Small decisions, usually invisible. Now they felt observed. I didn't change my route, not because I thought it mattered, because I wasn't sure what it would prove. I reached the building a few minutes early. That stood out too. Not significantly, just enough that I had time to stand outside for a moment, looking at the entrance before going in. I checked my phone. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, nothing out of place. Inside, everything felt the same. The low background noise, keyboards, voices, the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long. Normal. I walked to my desk, sat down, and saw the note. Folded once, placed under the edge of my keyboard. I picked it up. Do not speak to Claire. Short, direct, no explanation. I folded it again and left it on the desk. For a while, nothing happened. Emails, messages, routine. It almost worked. Then I went to make coffee. Claire was there. "Hey," she said. Normal, exactly as always. I felt the note before I remembered it. Still, I said, "Hey." The word came out easily. She watched me for a second. "I was going to message you," she said, "but you're here, so..." She paused, like she was checking something. "You said you didn't want me to bring it up again unless you brought it up first." I frowned. "What?" "Yesterday," she said, "before you left." I shook my head. I wasn't here yesterday. A small pause. "You were," she said, "just in the morning." Something tightened slightly. I didn't come in. She studied my face, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "Maybe I've got it wrong." But she didn't sound like she believed that. She picked up her mug. "You asked me something," she added, then told me not to ask you about it again. What did I ask? Another pause. "You asked if I'd seen you somewhere else." The sentence didn't connect to anything. I didn't ask that. She nodded again, slower this time. "Right." Then she left. Back at my desk, the note was still there. Do not speak to Claire. The wording hadn't changed, but the meaning had. Before, it was preventative. Now it felt late. Around noon, I got a message from Daniel. "Can you resend the file from earlier, the one you updated yesterday?" I opened the thread. There was no earlier message. I checked my sent folder. There it was, 11:43 a.m. yesterday. A file sent from my account.
I opened it. Edits I didn't remember making. Small, deliberate. I closed it, sent it again. A few seconds later, Daniel leaned over the partition. "Thanks," he said. Then, "You okay? You seemed a bit rushed yesterday." "I wasn't in yesterday," I said. Same sentence, same certainty. He blinked. "You were," he said. "Morning." I shook my head. "No." He held my gaze for a second, then sat back down. At 12:31, I checked my calendar. Yesterday. A block between 11 and 12. Untitled. I don't leave blocks blank. At 1, I went to the bathroom, not because I needed to, because I needed to confirm something. The mirror showed the same face. No change. Nothing missing. When I came back, there was another note. Unfolded. Flat on the desk. Leave at 1:12. Do not take the usual route. I checked the time. 1:07. At 1:12, I stood, picked up my bag, walked out. No hesitation. I didn't take my usual route. I turned left instead of right. The street felt slightly unfamiliar. Not completely, just enough. Then I saw it. A building, glass doors, badge reader. Something about it felt pre-existing, like I had been there before. I walked past it, then stopped, turned back. There was a sign beside the door. Entry logs recorded for security purposes. I stood there for a few seconds, then walked away. Back at my desk, the note was gone. No trace. At 2:03, a message appeared from Claire. "Did you go there?" No context. I didn't reply. At 2:17, the message disappeared. No deletion, no trace. I opened my sent folder. There was a message I hadn't written. To Claire, 1:26 p.m. I won't go back. Her reply beneath it. "Did you go there?" The sequence was intact, just not mine. At 2:41, I left again, not because of a note, because I needed something external. Something that didn't depend on me remembering. I walked back to the building. Same one, glass doors. Inside, a man sat at reception. "I think I might have been here yesterday," I said. He nodded. "We log entries," he said. "Name?" I told him. He checked. "You were here," he said. 11:17. He turned the screen slightly. My name. 11:17, entry. 11:52, exit. Clean. Recorded. "Do you want to see the camera?" he asked. I nodded. The footage was clear enough. Grainy, but usable. I watched myself walk in. Same clothes, same posture. Pause at the desk, speak, then walk inside. No hesitation, no confusion. Nothing missing. Another angle, a hallway. I walked past. Same pace I use every day. Then the exit, 11:52. I walked out, exactly the way I would. I looked at the screen, then back at him. "I don't remember that," I said. He nodded, neutral. Outside, everything felt the same. Nothing changed. Except there was now a record. Independent, complete. Back at my flat, everything was in place. The notes, the table, the quiet. I sat down, opened the notebook, added one more line. Confirmed entry. 11:17 to 11:52. No memory. I underlined it, then stopped, because there wasn't anything else to add. After a while, another note appeared, not folded, flat on the counter. I picked it up. The handwriting was mine, closer than before, almost exact. "You are not needed for every part." I read it once, then again. No instruction, no time, just a statement. I looked around the flat. Nothing had changed. Everything in place. Quiet, controlled. I tried to think back, not to the gaps, to the moments I was certain of. Standing here, holding the note. Those felt real, but they didn't define the rest. I set the note down, aligned it with the others, sat, hands still. Nothing else appeared. No correction, no new instruction. Just the understanding that whatever continues from here does not require me for all of it.